This episode contains scenes of the harsh reality of life and death in the Amazon that may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Unfortunately, we hit something. I don't know what we hit, but we hit something.
Welcome back to the Amazon. And for those of you new to the channel, allow us to introduce ourselves. My husband and I were living in Patagonia, operating our brew pub when COVID hit. After a year of travel restrictions, closed borders, and draconian quarantines, we fled back to the United States. During our absence, thanks in no small part to crooked business partners and a corrupt judicial system, we lost the business and nearly everything we owned. So we returned to Chile, liquidated what little we had left, and fled the country on our motorcycle, making our way north through South America with no real schedule and no idea what to do with our lives. We took a wrong turn in Ecuador, which finds us here, attempting to traverse the South American continent at its widest point, where there are no roads, across the Amazon. We had been stuck along the Peruvian-Ecuadorian border for a week. After an attempted hijacking of our Africa twin, and a number of missteps and false starts, we decided to detour to a small indigenous community while we waited on the cargo ship to Iquitos, Peru, on the Amazon River. In the meantime, we're here on Rio Aguarico, getting pounded by rain and snowed on with the cotton-like seeds of the kapok trees overhead. But luckily, the rain relented as we arrived at the port of entry for Airo Pai, a communal reserve on the Peruvian side of the border, home to the Sequoia people, who have called this region of the Amazon home for centuries. Activity in the reserve, totaling approximately 250,000 hectares, 620,000 acres, is regulated and highly restricted. And while there is no official census, there are an estimated 800 to 1,000 Sequoia living in the region, with the majority residing along the banks of Rio Putumayo, to our north, on the Peruvian-Colombian border. The western section of the reserve, along the Ecuadorian border, is home to smaller communities, typically consisting of a handful of extended families. We continued upriver until reaching the confluence with Rio Lagarto-Cocha, and continued through a maze of lagunas, stopping briefly to search for some of the Amazon's most unique and famous residents.
Oh, I saw him.
The pink dolphins. Before finally arriving in Puerto Estrella, a small village of approximately 50, who splintered off a larger community upriver about a decade ago. And while some of the villages in the reserve offer touristic services, this is not one of them. But after a bit of discussion, they agreed to let us stay the night.
There's between 7 and 9 families that live here in this community, and that's it. There was actually a bit of discussion as to whether or not we would be allowed to stay here. It was honestly, a little awkward. Because we were just kind of standing there while they were holding court. But hey, this is what we were looking for.
You were about to tell me how you smuggled your bike out of Argentina.
So when Rose and I moved to Chile in 2019, we got our residency, but we could not have a foreign motorcycle on a temporary import permit as residents. So we went through the process of importing the motorcycle and getting a Chilean license plate. But then when we left the country during COVID, our residency expired. So when we eventually returned to Chile, we did so as American tourists, not as Chilean residents. And there were a couple of occasions where we attempted to cross the border on the motorcycle and we got turned back because the motorcycle was registered to Chad Horton, the Chilean resident, not the American tourist. So, we tried to deal with various officials and, it turns out that we had one of two options. We could either renew our residency or sell the motorcycle, and we weren't willing to do either.
So you had to smuggle it out of Chile then, not Argentina?
No, we were able to actually cross the border into southern Argentina in transit on a restricted permit. So what we ended up doing was we ended up going to Buenos Aires, hopping on the ferry to Uruguay. And while we were on the ferry, we swapped the Chilean license plate out for the California license plate and entered Uruguay as American tourists on an American motorcycle.
And that worked with just the license plate? What about the title?
I had the California title. I still had it.
So you had a title for both Chile and the United States. Is that legal?
It worked.
Fair enough. So then back to the Amazon. Early in your trip, you stayed in a village where, and I want to quote you correctly, you said, the feeling that we weren't welcomed by everyone was palpable. Can you elaborate?
So we just sort of showed up. They had no way of knowing we were coming. And the couple that took us, they were going to go visit friends and they just brought us along for the ride. So when we got there, all the adults were in this communal longhouse working. And, they start kind of having a animated conversation in Sequoia. And Rose and I had no idea what was being said, but, there was some pointing and it got a little uncomfortable. So she and I just excused ourselves and went outside while they kind of discussed everything.
But if you didn't understand the conversation, why do you assume you weren't welcomed?
Well, I can read a room, and it's not always about what somebody says, but how they say it. So, when they were done talking and our guides came back outside, I just told them, I said, look, we obviously don't want to stay anywhere we're not welcome. If they don't want us here, we're more than happy to go. But he said, don't worry about it. The Apu said you can stay and his word is final. So
the Apu?
Yeah, they don't call them a chief, but every village has an elder that has the final say in all matters. I don't want to give you the wrong impression. Everybody that we interacted with was great, but it was obvious that some of the families were kind of giving us a wide berth, which was, we wanted to respect their space and not intrude as much as possible.
We were busy hanging our hammocks when school let out for the day, and the children were anxious to come meet the ñañeñe, or outsiders, who had just arrived. A small schoolhouse sits at the far end of the football pitch that serves as the centerpiece of the village. In many indigenous communities, it is common for children to receive their education in Spanish while speaking their native language, in this case, Sequoia, at home.
You can jump in there, play some football, babe?
I don't want to.
You don't want to show them up? I was going to, but on account of being a cripple and all.
And while the young men were taking advantage of the relatively cooler temperatures after the rain. The kids were more than happy to keep us entertained before lunch. After a traditional meal of rice, fish, and boiled plantains, while everyone else settled into their routine, we were invited to take a run to a local hunting spot. Along with fish, birds, and tortoises, larger game such as wild boar and tapirs are hunted for food. And we are on our way to a tapir rut. Tapir, the largest mammal in the Amazon, do not have a strict breeding season. So the rut is checked occasionally for any signs of activity.
Yeah, you got it. Man down.
Fortunately for me, I was able to borrow a pair of gum boots. Unfortunately for Chad, he's got big feet.
Unfortunately, they didn't have boots my size, so I got wet feet and muddy pants. I don't know, things could be worse.
And while we didn't find any tapir, we did find plenty of creepy crawlies along the way.
See that like one there? Yeah.
Most everything in the jungle has a practical use, even insects, such as these ants.
No, dulce is like poco ácido.
Como ácido, como
Yeah.
limón.
Yeah, limón, like ácido.
In this case, used to season food.
Wanna try?
How come you spit them all out right away?
Because I wasn't expecting that. It was like very acidic. Wanna try it?
Oh, it actually is so good. It's like lime salt.
Yeah, kinda. Well, you guys all saw it. Apparently Rose is no longer a vegetarian. She's out here eating bugs.
After slipping and slopping our way through the jungle for a couple hours, having failed to find its largest mammal, we decided to cut our losses and go in search of the Amazon's largest reptile and apex predator, the black caiman. So we returned to Estrella and waited for the cover of night to do a bit of spotlighting in the lagunas, which, as it turns out, doesn't make for great video. But trust me when I say that when you see dozens of eerily orange eyes peering back at you in the dark, it's an unsettling feeling.
It's gonna get you, Rose. You're gonna get your foot. And bite your toes off.
Oh, don't go in the hole.
And as cute as these little guys are, they grow into these guys.
Wow, he's a big one.
This one in particular, estimated to be 5 meters or 16 feet long. A man-eater.
Ciao, Chico. He's watching us, man. Pero comida? Sí.
The next morning, we loaded up the boat with a bit of jungle produce and sugarcane before saying our goodbyes and departing Airo Pai. With any luck, the cargo vessel and our motorcycle will be waiting for us back in Cabo Pantoja if we survive the sunset cruise back down the Napo.
Come up, come awake. Yeah.
The next morning, amidst a fury of chaos and confusion, we hurriedly packed and set off for the army base, where the soldiers were busy unloading a month's worth of provisions off the Vichu-2, our long-awaited cargo vessel to Iquitos.
All right, well, it looks like this is our home for the next 4 days. Interesting morning. I am completely soaked with sweat. It's a bit toasty out. We got the military base over here, and all these guys are unloading supplies from the boat that came from Iquitos. Gonna be interesting.
We set up shop as cargo and more passengers trickled in over the next few hours. And Chad familiarized himself with what would be our home for a bit longer than originally anticipated, including its washrooms. The kitchen, responsible for feeding the crew and passengers. The bar/bodega. And the cargo hold, which over the next few days would fill with a dizzying array of produce, animals, and God only knows what else, bound for Iquitos, the largest Peruvian city in the Amazon. This is the end of the line for the bi-monthly 600-kilometer, 375-mile voyage between the Peruvian-Ecuadorian frontera and Iquitos, the largest city in the world with no road access. This entire stretch of the Napo River and the remote villages that line its banks are reliant on the Vichu-2 to not only deliver food and supplies from Iquitos on the outbound journey, but transport their goods for market on the inbound journey, on which we have just departed. Nine days into our 3-hour tour, we were finally on our way.
What's Rose got? What she got?
I don't even know what it's called, but I'm so happy they have them.
And all smiles for the adventure that lie ahead. It's true what they say. Ignorance is bliss. The Amazon is in the grips of a severe drought, and water levels are at historic lows, changing the topography along the river as the riverbanks collapse, and sediment that would normally be carried downstream settles, creating new sandbars and altering the riverbed. It's also changed the locations and means by which cargo must be loaded. The economy of many of the villages in the region rely heavily upon selling produce, poultry, and livestock in Iquitos. And less than an hour into our journey downriver, we came face to face with the brutal reality of that trade.
Looks like this one didn't survive the trip over.
After losing one of the cows to drowning, a comedy of errors quickly ensued. Attempting to offload the skiff stored atop the passenger deck, two of the crew members flipped it over to empty the rainwater that had collected inside.
Glad I moved my motorcycle.
The rainwater started flooding the passenger deck, at which point two women slipped and fell while rushing to pick up their belongings. Simultaneously, the same crew members who flooded the passenger deck dropped the skiff's outboard motor in the river, flooding it as well, while the rest of the crew did their best to dress the cow with dull knives and machetes before the meat spoiled in the midday sun. And of course, they needed somewhere to put the meat.
Yeah, we've only been on the boat for like 20 minutes, so it's off to a rocky start. We've lost one outboard motor, we've lost a cow, we've injured two passengers, everybody's shit's wet, and what else? And there's no more ice cream. It's gonna all melt within about 2 minutes because it's like 120 degrees out.
This was only day one. But day and night mean nothing on the Vichu 2. The boat operates around the clock, arriving at random villages at all hours. And it was common to wake up next to a stranger in the morning, especially as we moved further downriver and hammock space grew harder and harder to find. We had spent a good portion of the night stuck in sandbars, and this morning proved to be no different. When the Vichu runs aground, the skiff acts as a tugboat, pushing it back into deeper waters. In shallow channels, it serves as a pilot boat, guiding the way. Meanwhile, the crew uses bamboo poles to probe the riverbed and assist with navigation, while the passengers enjoy their morning rations and find ways to pass the time. This is the calm before the storm, as we approach a cluster of scattered villages, all waiting to take their goods to market or hitch a ride somewhere downriver. When unexpectedly, the incessant drone of the Vichu's engines was drowned out by music as boats began approaching from all directions. And out of nowhere, as people hurriedly clambered aboard, a DJ took to the deck to hype up the crowd. As it turns out, the Vichu's captain is running for political office, and this is his campaign tour. But while he's busy vying for votes, others are at work, trying to put their thumb on the scale, which can be risky business. Because this is one bridge you can't afford to burn.
I think for me, this is the most fascinating portion of your time in the Amazon. I have taken the boat from Belém to Macapá in the north of Brazil, but this is a very different style of boat.
Yeah, I mean, some of those boats are a little dodgy as well, but yeah, I think if I recall correctly, our boat into Macapá had like a lounge on the upper deck and a bar, and they were playing music and people were dancing. I think the boat had Wi-Fi. It was a party boat. And often when somebody says, "Oh yeah, I've done the Amazon thing," I crossed the Amazon on a boat. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about the boat between Belém and Macapá, or Manaus and Santarém, where they spend a night or maybe two in a hammock on a party boat. But that's not what the boat to Iquitos was. This was a cargo vessel. It was steerage, and we almost got on the fast boat out of Cabo Pantoja, which would have had us to Iquitos, I think, in a day or two. And that's what most passengers do, or anybody with means. They take the fast boat. But hindsight being 2020, I'm glad we didn't.
You said previously that the journey into Iquitos was very eye-opening. In what ways do you mean?
It was a very unfiltered view of people that live a very raw existence. And, as we're about to start editing our footage of, our time in the Amazon. And, I've got to be careful with not only the footage we use, but how we present that footage, because, I don't want to get the video flagged or taken down by YouTube because some of the footage is disturbing. But I also don't want to give people the impression that I am in any way passing judgment. I remember at one point there were a few backpackers on the boat with us. And at one point I was filming what a lot of people would consider to be very abusive behavior towards animals. And she asked me, she's like, "Why are you filming that? This is disgusting." And I told her, I said, "Look, we're not here to pass judgment. We're not here to impose our views. We're just simply observing. We're documenting what life on the river is like." And so it's going to be challenging to figure out how to put that together.
But where do you draw the line?
Well, fortunately, I haven't been put in a position to have to find out. But, at the end of the day, my number one priority is keeping my wife safe. My number two priority is keeping myself safe. And I mean, beyond that, life is rarely lived in black and white.
I'm not sure I understand your answer.
Yeah, I'm not really sure I understood the question. Not all Americans are on a quest to spread democracy around the world. I think Rose and I are much more comfortable just being a fly on the wall. And I mean, slight detour, but this is kind of one of my pet peeves about this space, or YouTube specifically, I guess, is, you'll get creators or travel influencers or whatever you want to call them that are like, "Oh yeah, I'm a part-time nomad and, full-time activist." And, they go to some far-flung place and pretend to dissect some complex cultural issue. and then post a video on YouTube with some salacious title like, you know, The Truth Exposed, or what they don't want you to know about, you know, fill in the blank. And it's just like, oh, okay, you know, you just got here 3 days ago on your motorcycle and you've already managed to solve some decades old conflict. You know, well done you. You know, check that one right off the list. It's like, no, man, shut up. You have no idea what you're talking about.
And while Chad was happily immersed in the chaos, I was enjoying some guava, also known as the ice cream bean. Pod seeds covered in a soft, sweet pulp that are a favorite treat of local children. Sold to passengers, along with other sundry items, in villages along the way, for a nickel.
Yeah. Gracias.
As the cargo hold filled with produce and the passenger deck with people, an odd cast of characters started to develop, including a Peruvian-Australian couple who had been boat hopping between communities on the river, and a ragtag collection of backpackers hailing from Colombia, Argentina, France, and Ukraine, who had met at various locations throughout South America. It was an anomaly on a ship that typically only receives a handful of travelers over the course of a year to have 8 on the same passage.
It is hot. Really, really hot.
What isn't an anomaly is the ever-present heat, only briefly interrupted by the occasional afternoon thunderstorm.
Hear the thunder that time?
Your hair's standing up. You're not supposed to be up here.
Is my hair standing up?
Which have become less and less frequent over the past couple of years. But luckily, the passenger deck is fitted with tarps for just such an occasion, helping to keep out the rain and the blistering sun. But what they can't help with are the high-pitched screams piercing the darkness. A rude awakening, along with the dozens of roosters kept atop the roof deck, signifying the end of another sleepless night and the beginning of the breakfast queue. And this morning, we'll be having noodles, a bit of fresh beef from yesterday, and another boiled plantain. A balanced meal here on the Napo.
real city we've seen in 2 weeks.
Our third day on the V2 was a whirlwind, and running a day behind schedule. Both the passengers and crew's nerves were wearing thin by the time we arrived in Santa Clotilde, the halfway point on what was supposed to be a 4-day journey. And the only stop on the voyage, we had time to disembark and stretch our legs for a couple hours, where 2 of our fellow travelers used the opportunity to buy a cake for a boy celebrating his 2nd birthday on the river. A spontaneous act of kindness that he won't remember, but his mother will likely never forget. Unlike Chad, who only had vague recollections of the all-nighter he pulled, after a local Apu invited him to join his group for a beer or two out on deck. A melding of the minds into the wee hours of the morning until the V2 ran out of beer. This section of the Napo, either side of Masan, the largest city on the Peruvian side, sees a lot more activity and regular traffic than up north. Just a day from Iquitos, and already overloaded, this would be one of our final stops. And after the chaos and bluster we've grown accustomed to faded in our wake, an eerie calm and unexpected sense of reverence fell over the crew and passengers alike. As we finally reached the confluence with the mighty Amazon, a surreal moment set against a dramatic backdrop of thunderclouds in the distance. An unforeseen milestone of our impromptu crossing of the continent, and a special moment between Chad and the chicken he befriended the night before.
We made it, chicken. We made it to the Amazon. Congratulations. I love you.
Okay, but devil's advocate, where do you draw the line between being a fly on the wall and turning a blind eye? I think it's commendable when people try to raise awareness or help in some meaningful way, and to have purpose when they travel.
Well, I won't argue that. I mean, I know people that volunteer for organizations like Motorrad Angels that provide, health care and clean drinking water in poor communities, and that's absolutely commendable. But it would be disingenuous for me to pretend that we had some sort of purpose when we set off on this trip. At the end, it did end up being very meaningful and cathartic, but on a personal level.
So it's safe to say your motivations are purely hedonistic?
Well, if I understand correctly, hedonism is like the pursuit of pleasure, and I mean this was far from any sort of pleasure cruise.
Maybe not pleasure, but you both travel the world and skydive and scuba dive and things like this. Maybe hedonism is not the right word. It's more like thrill seeking, maybe.
Well, we've both been accused of being adrenaline junkies, but just speaking for myself, that's not at all what it's about. For me, exploring is about satisfying a curiosity and pushing past fear. And really, I think that's what fuels a lot of people that indulge in these sorts of pursuits. It's just trying to satisfy an insatiable curiosity.
But have you ever thought of using your travels to help raise awareness for social or environmental issues?
When you say something like raise awareness, it sounds like you're crusading for some cause. Maybe I'm just arguing semantics here, but I think there's a difference between raising awareness and simply trying to, open somebody's eyes to the world around them. I mean, we were in the middle of the Amazon during a historic drought. We rode our motorcycle through parts of the rainforest that were being burned to, clear way for cattle grazing. So, I mean, it'll definitely come up, but people are free to draw their own conclusions. I'm not going to give my opinion on something that I'm not qualified to talk about.
But the environmental disaster in the Amazon is not an opinion. It is a fact.
Well, don't forget, we spent 6 months in Brazil, so we've heard both sides of the story. And look, I think what's happening in the Amazon is absolutely tragic, but we live in a world where facts are really just whatever somebody has a vested interest in promoting, and then we're all expected to pick sides. So that's a game I'm not really interested in playing. Like I said, we're just here to present what it is we observed, and everybody is free to draw their own conclusions.
Having finally made it to the Amazon, the euphoria was quickly replaced with a chaotic sense of urgency. As the crew prepared to make land, and the passengers gathered their belongings, ready to disembark. But the rush was both short-lived and premature. We arrived long after the loading docks, or so they call them, were closed, and were forced to jockey for position just outside of town. Those who could scurried off the boat and disappeared into the twilight, while the rest of us prepared to settle in for one last sleepless night on the Vichu 2. At first light, we were on the move once again, making the short run to the docks, or so we thought. Instead, we made shore in the shadow of Puente Nanay, whereupon chaos and clamor ensued, in a mad rush to unload the vessel. But we had no delusions that we would be going anywhere anytime soon. So after packing up, we did our best to simply stay out of the way and keep a sharp eye on our gear to make sure none of it walked away amidst the mayhem. And fair warning to those of you with a weak stomach, some of the following scenes are a bit rough. Once again, viewer discretion is advised.
Well, I guess any delusions I had that there would be a real dock here in Iquitos have pretty much been shattered at this point. We're just on the banks of the river, and there's a steep, loose, shitty hill from the boat to the road. Not to mention a bunch of cows and pigs and bananas and a ton of other crap that needs to get unloaded. So, I don't know. This might not have been my best idea in the world.
But as it turns out, this wasn't our last stop. Just as Chad and I were preparing to start offloading our gear, the VQ-2 moved upriver a few hundred yards. A better spot for us, but unfortunately, not so much for the cows. And finally, after 5 long, slightly traumatic days on the VQ-2, we had arrived in Iquitos, Peru, on the mighty Amazon, the largest city in the world, with no road access. Now, all that was left was to figure out how to escape. On the next episode of Across the Amazon, we spend a week exploring Iquitos, including a tour of Monkey Island, before boarding the Gran Diego for a 3-day voyage to Tres Fronteras, where Peru, Colombia, and Brazil collide, deep in the heart of the Amazon.
Today's fronteras right here, Peru, Colombia, and Brazil. What a wild, wild spot on the planet this is.
And if you missed episode 1 of this series, go ahead and click on this video to see how we almost lost our motorcycle. And while you're at it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We're 2 Wheels, 3 Sheets, and we thank you for your support.